deeply.
For most people, the idea of incorporating sci-fi into fashion can only mean one thing: cosplay. And while the extremely dedicated community surrounding this hobby is massive, there are definitely other sci-fi enjoyers who'd rather express their interest in more subtle and practical ways. Luckily, the world of fashion and the genre of sci-fi has had a low-key but very consistent relationship that has spanned over decades. From insane runway pieces to more toned-down sci-fi references in consumer-level clothing brands, there is something for every level of fashion enthusiast. On the flip side of this, fashion has also left its mark on science fiction media, especially within film and TV. We will be getting into all of this, but first we need to go back to the mid-20th century where this all began. In 1957, the Soviet Union made history by successfully launching the first artificial satellite into Earth's orbit, called Sputnik 1. The USA took this very personally and decided to go band for band with the USSR, sparking one of the most notorious rivalries in human history, the space race. The governments on each side were more than happy for the public to become obsessed with outer space, as it only rallied more support for this scientific, technological, and political cause. The space race massively impacted pop culture, with its influence being evident in film, television, literature, design, architecture, and fashion. This influence would make its way to Parisian runways with the space-age fashion style that emerged midway through the 60s. The use of plastic was one of the defining features of 60s space-age fashion. At the time, the use of this material within the world of high fashion and couture was very new and innovative, as it required new design and construction techniques which all very well fitted into the future-facing, optimistic aesthetic that space-age fashion was all about. Retrospectively, that optimism that came with wearing plastic fashion seems ironic, given the context of what wearing plastic clothes means in the 21st century. The synthetic materials used in the 60s were utilized to make futuristic silhouettes, vinyl footwear, goggles, and helmets. Other defining features of space-age fashion included the use of weird geometries, patterns, and cutouts, and taking the already popular 60s mod fashion look and making it sci-fi. Pierre Cardin was one of the designers accredited to the space-age style. His 1964 Cosmocorps collection depicted what he thought outer space attire could look like. The mostly genderless collection is speculated to have inspired the costume design of Star Trek due to the very obvious similarities. Cardin was known for his geometric silhouettes and use of unconventional materials. During the same year, Courreges would release his space-age collection. His designs were known as the Moon Girl look, consisting of A-line dresses, go-go boots, miniskirts, goggles, and helmets. These clothes also utilized plastic materials, and he would go on to create space-inspired looks many years into the future. Paco Rabanne was also extremely prevalent within the 60s space-age fashion craze. He would not only incorporate unconventional materials, but he'd make full dresses, headpieces, and other garments completely out of metal, plastic, and even paper. His approach to space-age fashion felt less like dressing humans for the future like Courreges or Cardin, and more like he was creating the look of some sort of elegant alien race. Towards the end of the 20th century, Thierry Mugler began to try his hand at space-age couture in his extravagant and otherworldly runway collections. Throughout the 80s and 90s, he would frequently use sci-fi elements in his work. In 1995, he would present this robot suit which references Maria, or Maschinenmensch, the robot from Metropolis. This silent classic was released in 1927 and was the first feature-length sci-fi film ever to be released. Before all the letterboxd nerds start yapping in the comments, I know A Trip to the Moon was the first sci-fi film, but it only had a runtime of about 14 minutes, so definitely not a feature film. But anyway, this robot suit was very recently worn by Zendaya at the premiere of Dune 2. This attire seems appropriate for the premiere of such a grand and epic film like Dune.
Big Mac, Big Mac, Big Mac, Big Mac, Whopper.
Timothée Chalamet, on the other hand, decided to go for trousers that reference the SpongeBob depiction of science fiction, combined with what looks like a fucking Uniqlo t-shirt. Imagine stepping out in a fit so atrocious it nullified the aura of someone literally wearing an archive robot suit next to you. His fit really turned Timothy and Zendaya into Tim and Moby. On the topic of robots, Alexander Mcqueen created this look for the autumn-winter Givenchy runway show in 1999. Besides this robot/cyborg look, Mcqueen would also use this circuit board motif on multiple pieces in this collection. At this point, sci-fi inspired fashion had mainly been optimistic and almost utopian, especially when looking back at the space age stuff from the 60s. This collection had a darker and dystopian style, which suggests that the optimism that people had in the 60s of science fiction becoming a reality had faded away as we moved into the 21st century. Now that we are over 2 decades into the 2000s, I think it's safe to say that dystopian depictions of the future from the 20th century are becoming far more real than the hopeful utopian ones. The promise of partying in outer space from the 60s seems like it will only apply to balding men with billions of dollars, but zero fashion XP. Alexander Mcqueen's final finished collection would actually convey a fully realised dystopian sci-fi theme. His spring-summer 2010 show, Plato's Atlantis, was inspired by the concept of a post-apocalyptic future where global warming and rising sea levels have resulted in humanity returning to the ocean. The looks from this runway have a really alien look to them, which makes sense seeing as the work of the sci-fi art Go H.R. Giger was referenced in this show. On a side note, other than designing one of the most iconic aliens of all time, Giger has also had an influence on the fashion world that extends past just Plato's Atlantis. From the 90s up until very recently, multiple designers have referenced his work. Supreme even released a collection in collaboration with the artist in 2014. Anyway, back to the Mcqueen show. Plato's Atlantis was the first runway show ever to be live streamed on the internet, which they did via these robotic camera arms. This was very innovative and forward-thinking of Mcqueen, especially considering how big live streaming culture has become since that show. I would also say that live streaming has proven to be a fairly dystopian technological advancement and social phenomenon. Lots of very extreme things have been streamed online that YouTube definitely doesn't want me speaking about. That aside, the normal side of streaming has some very questionable aspects to it, and in general it is kind of nuts that watching multi-millionaires rotting in their bedrooms is a very popular category of entertainment nowadays. Other than the Plato's Atlantis collection, sci-fi themes were occasionally referenced on the runway throughout the 21st century, but it wasn't massively prevalent. People often describe the work of Iris van Herpen as sci-fi, but generally her clothes seem to be more about incorporating existing technologies and science into fashion. However, her recent 2023 collection did have some sort of sci-fi futuristic cities inspiration behind it, but I definitely do not have the fashion XP to break down and analyze something like this. However, I will say a lot of her work reminds me of the alien from Annihilation, so there's your science fiction little observation. There is one designer who I'd like to talk about who has on multiple occasions made whole collections inspired by sci-fi references. The designer in question is indeed Jun Takahashi. For his spring-summer 2011 Undercover collection, Takahashi created a fictional superhero called Underman. The year is 20XX, the world in which souls of people have been incapacitated by the forces of evil is empty. Underman is born to restore these lost souls. The battle against sorrow wages on. Underman! This slogan created for the collection summarizes the world and concepts surrounding Underman. This collection was born out of the collaboration between Jun Takahashi, art director Tetsuya Nagato, and photographer Katsuhide Morimoto, which resulted in one of the greatest photographic fashion campaigns of all time. Takahashi and his team set out to invoke childhood nostalgia with this campaign, as unsurprisingly, Ultraman was the inspiration. The character was one of Takahashi's childhood favorite superheroes. This passion mixed with an effective team of artists who were willing to go the extra mile in ways such as using real practical effects resulted in a really authentic looking product. If you looked at some of these photos without any context, you'd assume that they were from an old Japanese TV show. They even created free action figures with Medicom, which further adds to the childhood nostalgia theme that Takahashi was going for. You might think that Undercover selling collectible figures is a bit of a weird move, but if you refer to this diagram, you'll see that each audience has more in common than you might think. Besides, nowadays these massive bear brick figures are really popular within the streetwear scene for some reason. I don't really understand this, and yeah, you lot just seem like glorified Funko Pop collectors to me. The looks from the Underman collection were also shot in a miniature cityscape, which is a reference to the tokusatsu style of special effects that was used in shows such as Ultraman, Super Sentai, and a lot of the films and TV from the kaiju genre. The clothes from the Underman collection don't really convey any sci-fi themes, with the bulk of that coming from the campaign surrounding this release. With Jun Takahashi very obviously being an enjoyer of sci-fi and being known for referencing his interest in his work, it is no surprise that science fiction elements have taken more prominent influence in the design of some of Undercover's collections. For the Undercover Autumn-Winter 2018 men's collection, Jun would use 2001: A Space Odyssey by Stanley Kubrick as the main inspiration. This collection's references to the film range from very subtle to very blatant. For example, some looks like these would reference the outfits and clothes worn by characters in 2001, while others would reference specific moments in the film. Then there were cases like this where Jun would do his classic move, screenshot, copy and paste, slap that JPEG on a garment. I'm not the biggest fan of this style of graphics on clothes, but I assume most people aren't at the moment due to the fatigue from a certain style era. The most iconic and likely the most sought after item from this collection was the spacesuit puffer jacket. There's not much to analyze with this, it references one of the most recognizable sci-fi spacesuits of all time and even includes LEDs in the hoods to really sell the look. I think it's really cool that something like this exists and would look great for a Halloween costume for the individuals with the unlimited money glitch. 3 years later, Jun would release a new ready-to-wear collection with a new cult classic sci-fi franchise to incorporate into the clothes. Undercover Autumn-Winter 2021 would use the extremely popular moody mech series Neon Genesis Evangelion as its main inspiration. This collection had a similar approach to the references as his 2001: A Space Odyssey collection, in the sense that the references ranged from subtle to blatant, although I feel like these designs were more refined. For example, the pieces featuring graphics from the original media were actually stylized instead of being just straight screenshots. While there were some quite cosplay-esque pieces in this collection, we also got these puffer jackets which captured the design language of the Ava mechs from the series while also being more versatile and wearable than the 2001 puffer jackets. These could still be passed off as somewhat conventional puffer jackets to the uninitiated, but with that being said, if you put purple and green on any product, Evangelion fans will immediately assume it's an Ava 1 reference and start throwing money at it. At this point, I have only talked about designers whose sci-fi inspired creations mainly end up unattainable to the average fashion enjoyer. Due to the reputations of these designers, if these pieces do make it past the runway as ready-to-wear pieces, they usually become extremely rare, expensive, or just impractical to wear in general. This begs the question, are there any cases of conceptual sci-fi fashion being accessible to the average consumer? The answer to that question is HAMCUS, a Chinese brand carving out a niche in elevated sci-fi techwear. Originally starting out as a Guangzhou-based manufacturer for luxury fashion labels, in 2013 they would develop into their own brand and have since relocated to Hong Kong. At the core of HAMCUS is a fictional universe called Primus, or the Dust Universe, and each season of clothing releases seeks to expand this world-building project by introducing different races and groups of people. This quote from the brand sums up the concept. Primus universe is inhabited by many groups and individuals, races and societies that all have distinct appearances and corresponding dress patterns. Inspiration and influence for their appearances range from environment to specific background and developments of the broader world story. HAMCUS's founder and chief designer Tuff Liang said during an interview with Tech Hunter magazine that having their experience and foundation as a high-end manufacturer has enabled the brand to release a larger range of clothes each season. From a world building and a conceptual perspective, this is a massive advantage, especially when your goal is to create clothing that represents whole fictional races of people, as realistically you would need a large array of clothing to really sell that idea that the garments actually represent something that large. I can't really vouch for this being the most sustainable way of running a clothing brand, but it's worth noting that all the previous seasonal collections seem to stay available on the website and get heavily discounted until they are sold out. I also think this business strategy works uniquely well for HAMCUS, as unlike a lot of clothing labels, they are not trying to reinvent themselves every season and instead seek to build on the foundation of prior seasons to further expand the world-building element of the brand. Despite having a very large catalogue of clothes, HAMCUS is very good at conveying a vivid and coherent design language across their collections. The silhouettes, cuts, paneling, fabrics, and material treatments all feel very deliberate and have the purpose of creating a style ecosystem that gives the fictional universe depth. On the topic of HAMCUS' style as a brand, they have always been known for their grungy and earthy approach to their designs, and within the genre of sci-fi, that has more recently become very relevant to say the least, especially if you live on a desert planet and have a cosmic Fent addiction. I imagine a lot of people would find these clothes to be a bit too cosplay-esque, which I can understand, but I also think some of these garments could easily be incorporated into an outfit without having to pretend you're some sort of intergalactic asteroid miner. Also, I did say while introducing HAMCUS that they were an accessible answer to sci-fi fashion, which definitely did not take into account the pricing of these clothes. I understand that spending nearly $2,000 on an Arctic Apex Multimorph X4 cloak isn't exactly the epitome of accessible fashion. However, there is no other brand doing what HAMCUS is doing in terms of offering such a massive catalogue of extremely niche sci-fi inspired clothes. We've also got to consider that we're dealing with the genre of techwear here, which is notorious for high price tags. Ignoring the $1,800 cloak that I cherry-picked due to how expensive it is, the majority of the clothes retail for much lower prices, and while they're still not cheap by any means, it's reasonable for the product you are getting, and that's not accounting for the constant reduced prices and sales that the brand does for clothes from older collections. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that the brand does offer clothes that a lot of people who are into fashion would consider fairly priced. For around $300, a unique statement piece jacket is not an unheard of purchase for a fashion motherfucker to make. If you still disagree with me while having the Essence app downloaded on your phone, then you're a dickhead. One of my first reactions to seeing the depth of the brand's offerings was that a sci-fi film with full HAMCUS costume design would be really cool. That does exist in a shorter format, as the brand has released some short films over the years, with the most recent one being Exiles, which showcased the HAMCUS Adidas collab capsule collection. However, these are definitely more focused on being fashion films rather than narrative ones, but it's cool to see the world building element presented in a format other than photography. HAMCUS clothes have also been included in the costume design of large sci-fi productions such as Star Trek Discovery, Foundation, Rebel Moon, and Black Knight. While I have been praising HAMCUS for how they've imbued world building into their brand, I do wish the universe and story behind it was more fleshed out and more accessible. While you can find explanations summarizing the story behind different collections from the brand, if you want to learn more about the lore, then people recommend checking out the HAMCUS wiki. So that is what I did, and I found a very large, cluttered document that left me quite confused. I was expecting a very dense explanation of the Dust universe, detailing the origins of different races, space governments, and whatever, but instead I found a 90-page, very aesthetically designed slideshow which did include some explanations of the universe, but mainly consisted on how they plan to implement the world building, history of the brand, collabs, and press stuff. I think if you're going to do the full world building narrative fashion thing, then the brand should maybe have two separate wiki documents, as it feels a bit weird jumping between explaining some complicated aspect of the lore to them being like, oh, by the way, we collaborated with Adidas. I'm sorry, but name dropping Adidas doesn't exactly immerse me into a sci-fi universe. Don't get me wrong. I really like it when brands let us see behind the scenes and explain how they developed and what they're planning on doing next, but I do just wish HAMCUS had a separate lore and world building only document that would be structured similarly to something like All Tomorrow's. It feels like they are far more focused on explaining how they plan on implementing the storytelling and world building rather than actually doing it. And yeah, I get it. First and foremost, they are a brand that produces clothes and it's a lot of work just doing that, but ultimately this is what they signed up for. When I looked at the HAMCUS online store, I sort of expected to be able to quickly reference the wiki for what part of the universe each garment represents. Like this astro mining bomber has mineral collection pockets. What fucking minerals are being collected? I want to know that, not that Billie Eilish wore some of their clothes for a magazine shoot. Moving on, I wanted to briefly mention FFF Postal Service. The brand describes itself as a never-ending sci-fi motion picture. I have spoken about this brand on this channel before, and people in the comments pointed out that the concept and story behind their 2023 Covenant collection was allegedly an uncredited ripoff of Death Stranding. Personally, I've never played the game, but yeah, this seems fun, I guess. It does seem like the brand likes to take inspiration from existing media, seeing as their recent Spring-Summer 2024 collection is called Jurassic, and the Hypebeast article about this is literally called FFF Postal Service's Spring-Summer 24 draws inspiration from Jurassic Park. Also, the Covenant collection has some undeniable references to the film Alien Covenant, like apart from the name being the same, of course. Anyway, this is a convenient segue to the next part of the video where I talk about fashion designers who have worked on or influenced the costume design of sci-fi films. For the film Alien Covenant, costume designer Janty Yates would bring on Craig Green to work in partnership on the film. Yates was inspired by Green's Autumn-Winter 2015 collection, which featured looks like these utilitarian techie workwear ones, so she pulled up to his studio and asked him if he would be interested in working on an Alien film, to which he agreed. Apparently the majority of the design process was just converting pieces Green had previously created to work within the context of the film, but I guess that makes sense considering those were the designs that got him on the project in the first place. 60s space age fashion was also immortalized into cinema, with Paco Rabanne doing the costume design for the 1968 sci-fi film Barbarella. The outfits of the protagonists, played by Jane Fonda, featured Rabanne's iconic use of chainmail as well as other design elements that were shared by all the 60s space age fashion designers. This is likely the first example of a renowned and accomplished fashion designer from the world of haute couture being brought onto a sci-fi film production, and it didn't happen again until nearly 30 years later. The 1997 film The Fifth Element, directed by Luc Besson, featured costume design by Jean-Paul Gaultier, who ended up designing over 1,000 costumes for the film, which was narrowed down from around 5,000 sketches. The work required was supposedly the equivalent of doing around 10 conventional fashion collections. This film broke the mold in terms of sci-fi costume design, as it subverted the standard utilitarian style that you'd expect from most films of the genre, and instead went for a bright, colourful and extravagant look. To me, this feels like a modernized version of 60s space age fashion. The flamboyance of these outfits just look like they resonate more with the themes and perspectives of science fiction that the 60s space age fashion designers were experimenting with, rather than the utilitarian or techie look that is synonymous with the sci-fi genre. Just like how Cardin, Courreges and Rabanne would famously utilize unconventional materials such as plastic, metal or paper, Gaultier would incorporate plexiglass, rubber and neoprene into the costumes of the Fifth Element. It's also worth noting that, without any prior formal training, Gaultier's first opportunity in the fashion industry was working as an assistant to Pierre Cardin, so a similar approach to sci-fi fashion wouldn't be surprising. In the present year of 2024, it's hard to talk about the genre of sci-fi without mentioning Dune. The franchise has not only single-handedly rekindled a mainstream interest in the science fiction genre, but has also presented a really fresh take on science fiction costume design that has clearly taken inspiration from the fashion industry. For starters, Florence Pugh's character Princess Irulan wears a reworked version of a look from Julien Desenna's 2020-21 Autumn-Winter Paco Rabanne collection. I think the costume department couldn't have made a better decision than referencing the work of Paco Rabanne for this character. She is a princess of a futuristic space empire that heavily references medieval politics, so using clothes from a label of a designer who is famous for referencing medieval chainmail but recontextualizing it into a futuristic space-age style just makes sense. Jacqueline West, who was the costume designer on both Dune films, said that her work on the franchise drew a lot from the art of Giger. I think this is quite evident in the design of the still suits, which seem to reference the biomechanical art style that the artist is famous for. H.R. Giger once again proves himself to be one of the most visually influential figureheads in the sci-fi genre. Although it's not officially stated by West, it's abundantly clear that this franchise is riddled with the influence of Rick Owens. The designer's dark and gothic style is very obviously what informed the aesthetic of the Harkonnens. Characters like Fade Ralpha look almost identical to how Rick styles his runway models. It's also worth mentioning that Rick Owens is literally married to a real-life Bene Gesserit. I would not be surprised if Michelle Lamy was on the mood boards during the pre-production stage of Dune. On the subject of Rick, a pair of modified Beetle Bozo tractor boots were used in the outfit worn by the fifth brother in the Kenobi TV show, so yeah, Rick Owens is canon in Star Wars, and unsurprisingly, his clientele is the dark side. And that concludes a brief history and showcase of sci-fi's relationship with fashion. This video was mainly focused on the subjects and examples that I found the most interesting, and with a topic this large, there will be stuff I didn't touch on, so if there's anything I missed out that you think is worth talking about, then please leave a comment. That's the end of the video, goodbye.